At the beginning of our sessions yesterday morning, Sister Barbara gave a wonderful presentation and asked us to be open-minded and to be considerate of one another and not to have any thoughts of fear or threatening nature in any of our discussions, not just here, but in any of our discussions. And I think that's appropriate. I told her, I said, I wish you could get on the national news and say that. And then I challenged everyone to think about an idea that you would hear in these 2 days that would change you. And so as we go into this session, I would like to encourage you as you hear some summaries and synthesis of pulling together what we have heard today, that you might listen again and be reminded of some things that you heard that you want to take home with you to do more reflection on, that might change you, might change an approach that you have, or give you an idea of something new to do. So we have, get the right ones, we have Russ Hiddinger, Father Michael Sweeney, and Father Richard Schenk, who will give a few minutes summary each on various aspects of the colloquium. Thank you.
When we first sketched out the possibility about a year ago for the Convocation treating this very broad theme of stewardship of knowledge, I actually proposed that we think again about doing it. It sounded very stiff. And especially maybe too philosophical, and who knows. And the fellows were quite insistent that we move ahead with stewardship of knowledge. And I'm delighted to see how what I thought was a very stiff theme was as fruitful as it was. I mean, it's beyond the ability to summarize in 5 minutes all of the fantastic 10, 20-minute interventions that have been made over the last 2 days. We've talked about institutions, the university, schools, religious orders, corporations, for-profit, not-for-profit, governments, parts thereof, the law, stewardship of knowledge of the law, the judicial role, social imaginaries of all sorts, including that ultimate source of knowledge, the black box of the market, perhaps, the swarms of little gods. Hayek disclaimed that any of us could be knowledgeable enough to replace the market, which I've always thought carried the inference that the market was very smart. We have examined not only major institutions, but forums and maybe platforms, labs, programs, popular media, especially the ones with the whammos, internet networks of all sorts, fantastic reflections on Amazon to the foot of the cross. We also discussed, and I thought we could have even done more with it, who are the patrons? Greg Wolf raised this in the case of the arts, the donorcrats, brought to you by. You know, you go to the baseball game, the seventh inning is brought to you by, Anheuser-Busch. I think that's a very important issue. Who is it being brought to us by anymore, especially given the incredible plurification of all of the sources of knowledge. We've talked about who evangelizes whom. I'm only going to say something about the one that interests me the most, because I'm in it. It's my 70th semester. It's 35 years in universities. I teach. I also do research, but I no longer need the university to do research. Not in my field. The internet's very handy on this one. And other forums and platforms are very handy as well. But I would not be a teacher if it were not for the university. It's essentially what I do. And universities have been, well, since the high Middle Ages, but especially since World War II in this country, the hub. I mean, for business, knowledge, theology, agriculture, space program. The Manhattan Project would have been impossible without it. I mean, the scientists at Berkeley, Princeton, Harvard, all those places were looted to be put up in the high desert outside of Taos. Universities, the source of the internet in UCLA. It's the main place where the generations meet to transfer knowledge in our culture. They're also, remarkably since World War II, in this country, relatively class-free. I mean, get outside the top 25. They're relatively class-free. The middle class and in lower middle class got access to the universities. And I think that Agnieszka raised some very serious problems. Others did too. That these are no longer places that sustain education broadly. Like, how does it all fit together? Faculties are largely into research. And what's worse, they seem to have business models that are not sustainable. And suppose for a moment that they are not sustainable. Suppose, a la Polanyi's Great Transformation, 40% of them go over 10, 20, 30 years. What's going to happen? Well, I don't know, but I know one thing that will almost inevitably happen is that education will not be dispersed into the internet. It will be forced downward into the K through 12 system. Because a lot of what universities do are what high schools used to do, to be perfectly honest. And the K through 12 system in this country, both private and public, is really hurting. In fact, the business models of those places are in worse repair even than many of our colleges and universities. I'm worried about a domino effect, a cybernetical one, in which 20 different causes are going on at once that are going to make not only the university, but institutional education and stewardship of knowledge all the way down, quite unsustainable, and that it's happening more quickly than what either our public sector can do with K through 12 or the rest of our sector will do with the higher levels of it. It really bothers me. It's my summary.
It's interesting, we had not conferred on this at all, and so I can be quite brief because I would echo the stewardship of knowledge is interesting, very interesting to me, because stewardship implies, as Russ has said, as many of us have said, an institution, and so it really must be institutionalized. It concerns me very much, as I said myself at the beginning, that I wonder how many in our culture now really enjoy a sustained conversation with someone for whom this is important. And so I mean a conversation that isn't simply days or weeks, but perhaps over a lifetime, that sustained conversation is one of the fundamental ways in which the faith is transmitted. And so I think it is very necessary for us as a church, as an order, exactly and very intentionally to invite into conversation. The place of the church, certainly in the last 500 years, has gradually moved to the periphery rather than to the center of much modern conversation. That should be something that we take into account as well. But with the universities to some degree threatened, and threatened, I think, by the way, to ideologically. And unfortunately, one of the ways I think the university as an educational institution has been corrupted is that the faculty no longer have much to say about the governance of a university. And so the stability, institutional stability of the university itself, even if they were to persist as they are now, has become problematic. And so I looked up diversity on the internet, for example, and it simply means diversity. It's a complete circle. Everyone is diverse, and so we ought to recognize diversity. I suppose if we took this rigorously, any act of education would be an act of violence or an act against diversity, wouldn't it? So what is desperately needed is a conversation grounded in real human experience that is not susceptible of the latest fad. And I really do see this is one of the fundamental obligations of our church, and something that we've always, in fact, done very well. Early in the order, wherever there was a priory, there was, in fact, established a theological conversation that sometimes turned into actually a university or institution. So this has been important from the beginning. I think it's urgent now. The manner of that conversation is, I think, something that we should look at closely, and also who our conversation partners might be. This is why, by the way, again, I'm deeply grateful for and appreciative of the fellows of the school and those who join with us in the conversation we've begun here.
Well, I'm not sure that the second echo is any stronger than the first. Usually they kind of peter out, but I too would want to echo what the two speakers before me have said. There's a parallel that struck me, though perhaps in a somewhat different mode, where it's not about feeling excellent, but perhaps something else. But you know the story of St. Anthony the Great. He had spent many years in the desert and had overcome many temptations to give up and whatever. But finally, the devil found a way to really bother him, something he couldn't shake, and that was by telling him he was doing a pretty good job. Yeah. There's probably no one who's actually quite as holy as you. And Anthony, he realized he needed divine help. Now, most of us aren't quite in that situation. But we do all get in the situation where we think nothing else is really going on. Nothing here either, but nothing out there. And so we seem to start thinking, nah, it's a pretty cold world. Well, what God did for Anthony was he said, okay, I'll help you out this time. And he sent him off and he brings him to the hermit St. Paul, who is in fact a much more impressive figure. And Anthony goes away happy. Of course, as the stories go, then Paul dies right at that moment, so Anthony rushes back and gets a little keepsake. But it's to remind him that something else is going on. And even if we're not in the temptation to think that we're the greatest thing on earth, it is important to take advantage of seeing that a lot of other things are going on. That's something that happens in our own field when we think sometimes that there's not much advance in literature, and then we stumble all of a sudden across 10 titles we know we should read, and fascinating themes we never thought of. That's even in areas close to our own fields. But I suppose the great grace of a meeting like this, of the fellows and of their friends, is that we see how much really is going on. And many of the talks, in fact, were a little bit like that gift of meeting the hermit St. Paul and seeing how much life is there. Other problems too. It's not just to see people's successes, but to see them wrestling with the problems. And just to recall the big titles of what we've been looking at with biblical and pastoral perspectives, theology and philosophy, education, arts and sciences, economics and ecology, health and welfare, technology and planning, governance and jurisprudence, and that was broken down into many fascinating stories of service and of attention paid to people. I think it shows us the wisdom of knowing that there's something parallel to what Kant said about concepts without perceptions would be simply empty, and perceptions without concepts would be blind. Well, the faith alone as proclamation, if it didn't manage to become concrete in service and in dialogue, would be empty. And the attempt to do dialogue and service without that relationship to the gospel can often be very blind. But when they come together, there's a rich unity that's there. And yet it's a unity that one never has for oneself. And so it struck me about the title, which is probably a little bit, needs to be a little bit extended perhaps. A steward never owns the goods that he or she administers. Stewards, even in the gospel, are just lend the goods that they're meant to manage. That's what we talk about, stewardship of creation, because it's not really ours. And we need to pass it on to future generations because it's something that they also need to be stewards of. And so it is with proclamation and evangelization, if you like. Evangelization is only there where proclamation and dialogue come together. And that can only happen when there are many, many people involved doing good work. And I think that's why the DSPT can be very thankful that it has the fellows and the friends that the fellows manage to draw in, because that makes the issues of philosophy and theology with which they've been struggling to become quite concrete, quite open to service. And it's something that, obviously the word, Michael, social imaginary, seemed to strike everyone's imagination here, but it is in fact the kind of concretization that one needs in order to have the right sort of imagination about philosophy and theology as well. And I would like to suggest that what one discovers in philosophy and theology can be of help also in making for a better service and making then also for a better dialogue. So I've enjoyed being here, something of a sort of a guest from the outside, but it certainly has been a privilege, and I wish all the best to the future of the school and of the fellows.
Thank you very much for your reflections. When the fellows met a year ago to discuss this topic, they realized that at that time, the Dominicans had already just started celebrating the 800th anniversary jubilee of the Dominican order, and that during the year that we Dominicans would be looking at our past 800 years, which we did. We had special pilgrimages and tours following the steps of St. Dominic, and many of us went to Europe to start at his birthplace, follow his steps in ministry through southern France from Spain, on all the way to Italy, to his place of death. And that the fellows were thinking, at this time, this weekend, we would be at the end of our Jubilee, and it would be time for us to look at the future of the Dominican order. And so all of the talks, all of the sessions, I think have really looked at issues that we have to address. We Dominicans have to address these issues for the future of the order, for our future of following in the steps of St. Dominic in preaching the truth of the Gospels. And how are we going to do that in light of many of the issues that came out today, of loving one another as we love ourselves, of looking at the role of technology, looking at the future of institutions, of the environment. How is all that going to affect our role as preachers? And how is all of that going to affect all of us in what we do for the future in our own areas of expertise? At this time, I would like to take the next 30 minutes.
Yes. Yes, we have time until 5:15.
Yeah, until about 10 after 4. I'm sorry, 10 after 5. And what did you all pick up from your experience here? Was there an idea that really kind of jumped out at you? What did you think about the synthesis of the talks and how the talks came together? Any comments that you have we would like to hear and have you share with us?
If nobody else wants to say something. Well, something that came to me earlier was at Barbara's talk, when she said that there's one thing that the government cannot do, that is love, because that's something that persons individually do. It's a personal thing, literally. But I think that translates into some other areas too. It's not just governments who cannot do that, it's also Amazon. And all these other pagan gods, that we use. And robots. And robots, exactly. That's what was my next thing, so I mean robots. And by the way, that idea has been around. I think the earliest time that robots were envisioned as helpers in the household is a Father Brown story by G.K. Chesterton from 1920s or so. Anyway, but robots cannot do that. And so that leads me to the question, well, what is the human culture that we should be fostering? Why not let the robots have all this other kind of stuff? We don't need to drive trucks necessarily. I mean, it needs to be a transition, obviously, for people who are truck drivers. But in the long run, that's not what our human dignity depends on, that we can do that, right? So what are the kind of institutions that embody love, but also knowledge? So maybe, some institutions of higher learning might go away, but will there not be more of a need for learning? What do we do with all the time that we gain by not having to drive trucks, right? So isn't that time for contemplation, time for reading, time for these extended conversations? Is that not a higher demand under these circumstances? And these are all personal things. That's not something computers do, and computers would be interested in because computers don't have interests. They're just machines. And so that's sort of the thought in the back of my mind. You know, how does a culture look like that might be delivered from certain needs, but still wants to do something with its life, right? And so that includes healthcare. You know, the things about healthcare, but the healthcare is personal. It's not just the delivery by robots or technology. It's a personal kind of thing. And so what Bill Cox said about parishes being able to get involved in that, it's a communal thing, it's institutional, it's cultural. So what are these institutions that might embody that?
Thank you. These are always stimulating and fascinating to see that stewardship of knowledge to a variety of disciplines, if you will. And I appreciated the comments by the panel relative to the stewardship of knowledge. And I think if we place that in the context of that we've discussed of the culture within which we live right now, we find ourselves in, and as Greg mentioned, I mean, the pace of change is dramatic, and its impact on all the institutions as well as the faith life of people in the society is astounding. And we're just starting in so many ways to get our mind around what that might mean. The stewardship of knowledge, it appears to me from what we're seeing here, while we've relied on certain institutions to be the repository of that stewardship of knowledge, that's changing, and changing dramatically. And so the challenge for us in the spirit of the Dominican tradition and in the culture and the mission of our church is to figure out how we either find where that knowledge is being stored, where that knowledge is being kept, if it were stewarded, if you will, and where it could be stewarded, both in the universities, in the priories, as was mentioned, in communities of people who have formed around those particular disciplines, and finding ways that we engage that and figuring out what we do there. And perhaps even the creation of formation centers, as Bill brought up in his around Catholic healthcare. You know, we've got to find some ways to be present to and in dialogue with as we look at the stewardship of knowledge. The second part of the title of our conversation here was about the evangelization of the culture, which takes me back to the same reflection about, you know, how do you evangelize when all the cultural supports institutionally, which provided the opportunity to invite someone to be a disciple and to engage in the mission of evangelization with the church, have changed. And we all know from our own experience that even our children who go through, 8 years or 12 years of high school and elementary education and college in a Catholic setting don't necessarily come out in this culture and this society as committed to or interested in or even intrigued by a sense of discipleship and being part of that mission. But what we see here is that in this more self-referential experience of a new generation in this particular culture, people are called to a variety of things with their own angst and everything else we've talked about. They're called to those moments. But are we present and walking that journey with them? Are we finding ways to invite people in economics to say, anyone who might be interested in finding out, how the Catholic social thought might impact that ethics reality? Yes, we have universities, but we got all sorts of people working in the economic reality. We have cultural situations we had set up with, legatus for, people doing this, and we'd set up, Thomas More societies. Those all relied on a different cultural imperative that was there. We have to go out into those marketplaces, whether that's education, whether that's arts, whether that's healthcare, whether that's entertainment, whether that's law, whether that's government, technology in particular, economics. We got to go out into those marketplaces and invite people into an experience of formation that is referenced in their particular questions that they're experiencing as they try and engage. And I think as we do that as communities of people, we will find ways to invite people, because we all know, and we're privileged to know, the beauty of our tradition and the beauty of our history and the beauty of our engagement with the Lord. And we're privileged to know that. We're struggling right now with whether or not we're going to continue to talk to each other and continue to uphold, as we do right now, a lot of structures and institutions that make those of us who already experience that feel good, but don't lead us in the direction of evangelizing the culture and inviting people into that paradigm. And I'm not trying to dismiss what we have going in a variety of those things as much as I'm trying to invite us into a different conversation around where will knowledge be stewarded in the future in these different areas where we can dialogue with it, and where are the people who we will invite into discipleship to be part of this evangelization of that culture. Where will they encounter both the Lord and encounter the tradition and the history that we bring together in philosophy and theology. So I don't have a lot of answers other than saying we got the opportunity to be very creative. If we can interest ourselves, if we can interest our partners, if we can interest the larger church society in rethinking how we're going to engage this. So thank you, that's my podium.
I was reviewing my notes from yesterday, and the phrase I wrote down that really jumped out for me, and I think maybe sums up the conference, is a comment somebody made. I apologize, I don't remember who said it, but I'm paraphrasing to say, they said, we used to ask people at cocktail parties, what do you do? And what we'd like to do now is ask, what problems are you trying to solve? And I think whether you're in the realm of education or business or pastoral care or politics, I think we're all represented here. This phrase, what problem are you trying to solve, I think is so relevant to today. And I think as a summary from my experience of this weekend is that it represents how energizing this sort of open dialogue and communication of different ideas has been. Because I think that really sums it up. What problem, in my case, am I trying to solve? And I think all of us in having this dialogue should feel very energized that having heard these different perspectives, and different perspectives especially as they relate to our Catholic faith, that we all have a role to play and can make a difference in the world. So moving from a very perfunctory sort of what do you do to a perspective of how am I trying to help, what problem am I solving, I think is just an amazingly energizing and forward-looking and hopeful statement. So I'm appreciative we've had this opportunity.
Lots of questions or comments.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to build off of Father Anselm's reflection a little bit. That's something that kind of struck me too, is what our culture really needs is the same thing that cultures have always needed, is being the love of Christ, and how to make that relevant to our own culture. Kind of a follow-up point on that. I was struck by the analogy to when the church really was its most effective in terms of its most powerful evangelization force, really came out of the times when it was persecuted. And I think that's something that we should think about and take seriously, and also kind of connects to some of the reflections about the cross. And it really comes out of time of persecution when we can be the most effective evangelizers. And I think that the persecution that we're seeing takes on a different look, different feel than it was with the pagans and with the disease and plague. But in a lot of ways, I think in all of our disciplines, we're facing a culture that kind of is antagonistic towards us. And I think to be mindful of how Christians have done it throughout the centuries of trying to love your enemies and see them as God sees them and love them, and really desire the conversion of their hearts and desire their good. And I think that will have the biggest impact in all the different areas that we're in.
Well, I'm just going to repeat what was just said in other words, I think. But I still have a remnant of an East Tennessee accent, in which case you're going to think I'm some yokel out of a Flannery O'Connor short story. But, but Jesus is at the heart of this. And I'm so appreciative that Barbara brought that up so powerfully, and other people have too. But our faith is based on this figure who changed history. History now pivots on that figure. No matter what's happening, no matter how many changes are going on, ultimately, that was the turnaround moment in human history. Everything changed. And until we can bring people to a better understanding, and ourselves, we have to, there's no question more fascinating than the question of who is that man? Not who was that man. Who is that man? And we need to become, if Jesus Christ isn't the most fascinating figure you have ever encountered, you have either not encountered him or you have a screw loose. So what we need to do is encounter this figure and let the impact of that encounter radiate out, which is what the church is. So I'm not saying anything new to anybody, but I do think that we can be overwhelmed by strategies and plans and programs and historical events and so on and so forth. No historical event is going to make what happened 2,000 years ago in the least bit less central to all our lives. And we somehow need to become custodians of that contagion, as well as do all the things that we've talked about here in the last couple of days. Those things are absolutely important. But unless they are radiated by this total fascination with the God-man himself, they will just be plans and projects. And I mean, that sounds like I'm chiding. I'm not chiding at all. I was totally fascinated by just about everything that was said here. But I just did want to remind, and of course I'm copying somebody who just reminded us, that fascination has to be, it's contagious, and we should allow it to be contagious in whatever way we can.
Thank you. In the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, at one point Calvin says to his teacher, "May I be excused? My brain is full." And in many respects, a colloquium like this is just such a fascinating experience in stuffing the brain with ideas that I've never had. I think the thing that I would use to sum it up, simply to add to what other people have said, is remembering Jesus' words, whatsoever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. And whether it's the homeless on the streets of Houston or truck drivers who until today I didn't realize were going to be unemployed, 3 million of them, to adjunct professors who in the failing university system may never have a job, to cyberbullying and the number of students who are committing suicide every year that we don't even know about, or the astonishing rate of 20 veterans per day. It seems to me that coming out of this question of the stewardship of knowledge, if we bear in mind that the least among us may be people we've never perceived as being least before, that would be an important insight to carry with us. Thank you.
I just wanted to tie in with what Gil said, and it reminded me of something in the lineamenta for the Synod on the New Evangelization. That what does the church do in times like this, and in a culture that's hostile and things of that sort? Turn to Christ, and that just really struck me so profoundly. And tying in with what Ned said back there, which is, I think, critical. An important part of stewardship of knowledge is how do we transfer the knowledge of truth, and that's something that needs to be, I think, reflected on. And Father Sweeney, talked about addressing what people are seeking, addressing their experience, and things of that sort. And in thinking about all this, revelation is, as St. Thomas describes as sacred science, it's knowledge. And in the culture, we don't think of it as knowledge, and there's different ways of receiving knowledge. But with sacred scripture and with the intersection of philosophy, the church has developed a very coherent, it's perfection as you read it, development of teachings, and I'm in awe of it the more I see it, and and the more I understand it, and as Professor Brennan said, the students have very little knowledge of this when they go to college, or even through college, and the lady has very little knowledge of this. So I think it's a big challenge. And one of the things that struck me as I've been working in this area for a number of years is that, if we're evangelizing culture, the dialectic isn't necessarily the best way to evangelize, because it involves conflict. Dialogue is important, of course, but it's not necessarily a great evangelization method. It's an intellectual method, and I may be totally wrong on this, but I just think we need to think of new ways in this age where people think subjectively. There's no principles of reality that people are grounded on anymore. That they can imagine themselves to be whatever, and which makes them God, rather than learning what it means to be made in the image of God and all the consequences, leads people to fall into lifestyles that are essentially living a false anthropology, which is a human disaster that leads to loneliness and away from everything that we truly seek. So I just throw that out there, for some consideration of something that might be discussed and explored in the future.
It has been an absolutely inspiring time. The brain is just blowing totally off the top. I've been sending texts back to my husband saying, this is extraordinary. Anyway, you have really opened things, a perspective on fields that I don't often get to think about. The convergence of science with faith, for example, is extraordinary. And to think about it in a way that is compelling and persuasive and also beautiful, and giving us an idea of the convergence of thinking about the economy, for example, with social entrepreneurs. The idea of rethinking what a presence in the public space looks like. That's all been amazing. One thing we didn't talk about that I am concerned about is this, the realm of participating, living our faith in the public square is being increasingly curtailed, and I don't know what the answer is to that, but the idea of being a witness, of living your faith, is increasingly curtailed if you receive any kind of government funding. So for a university, if you don't get direct funding, but you have government guaranteed loans for your students, you still are liable for a whole host of things that come with that. Title IX, et cetera, et cetera. Hillsdale is one of the few colleges that managed to resist that temptation. Wyoming Catholic is another. They have actually financed the loans to the students themselves, but it has rendered them financially more fragile than they would be otherwise. the health insurance mandates, even down to zoning. I mean, Mother Teresa declined to have an elevator put into one of her buildings when she found out it was going to cost $500,000. She said, well, we'll do without. We will carry the people if necessary. I learned this from her lawyer. Let me just ask you, what kind of a world is when Mother Teresa needs a lawyer? But what we are increasingly hearing from our political leaders, they are talking now not of freedom of religion. It's not about the First Amendment. They're talking about the freedom to worship. Have you heard that phrase? It's a very pernicious phrase. And I recognize it from the people who lived under communism in the Soviet Union, who on paper had that freedom as well. I'm thinking of one of the people that I interviewed. I did a book about the collapse of communism and the people who resisted because of their Christian faith. One of them was Alexander Ogorodnikov, and he sparked a kind of renewal of people of faith in the Russian Orthodox Church. He was also then threatened with imprisonment, and he said, then put me in prison. And they decided that he had enough of a visibility that it would be unpleasant, maybe make him a martyr. They said, why don't you just emigrate? Go to another country, here's a passport, you can go to Switzerland. And he said, no. He said, it is up to us to live our faith. What the government wants us to do is to leave it at the door of the church like a piece of luggage, and then walk out and not have the church influence our actions. There's an eerie ring of familiarity that comes with that now, because we are being asked to increasingly worship the way we want to, but if your convictions affect the law that you would endorse, or the prescriptions that you would fill, or the abortion that you refuse to perform as a doctor, if any of those things take place, we are now left exposed to the whim, really, of an increasingly hostile government. That part concerns me. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm thinking of Alexander Ogorodnikov, who foresaw that his price was going to prison. I hope it's not that for us, but it may well be at some point. Just stop there.
I'm a deacon in a local Catholic church, and I wanted to share with you, we recently sponsored a bus for Walk for Life, and we charge like $20 and it costs $50. And I went up on the AMBO, and I actually, went over all the pro-life activities in our parish. And then I actually asked the people to, donate for this. And it was successful. People came out of the blue and gave $200, $100, and we made money for the pro-life movement. My bigger theme is, I think, especially for my generation, the baby boomer generation, I'm 63, we need to do like John Kennedy did and ask people to do more. That there is particularly our generation, when you heard about all the problems primarily facing younger people, the younger people here today, as they go through this current of change, I think we need to ask more of people, as John F. Kennedy did. Ask not what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. We need to do that as Catholics.
It seems to me that a unifying theme here, perhaps of just about every talk in one way or another, said something to the effect that true happiness lies outside of what the ordinary, what the world is, in a sense, saying. And I think that's, of course, we know that St. Thomas Aquinas' anthropology in a significant way is centered around that insight that everyone seeks to be happy. No one could say they don't want to be happy. What does it take to be happy? And one of the things that is a universal desire is to know, of course. And so, in one way or another, each of us, most of the talks that we've heard have in some way referenced that. We heard from Anthony Annette about
something lifting us up to a higher level of happiness. It's important for us when we consider how to evangelize the culture, I believe, to recognize that, to recognize in a way that we have an insight of what it takes to be happy, that to know and to know more, and then to know God is going to, in a sense, bring us the greatest happiness, of course, along with love. If we don't love God as well, we're a resounding gong. So we have that to offer, and we can, in some way, awaken that in our hearers, somehow to present, finally, at some point or another, that Jesus Christ himself is not only the way and the life, but also the truth, and that this is in our various ways of seeking the truth and the true joy that comes with love of others, that can be something that is appealing to everyone.
I would like to thank and honor the Dominicans here for this opportunity. And not all of us are in a public sphere. I'm a book collector by nature, and some of the things that have been discussed have been sobering. But it made me think of the book, A Canticle for Leibowitz. And as strange as that book is, I go back to it and I think often of it, and I'm filled with hope. I recommend that book to everybody. I also feel that in our different fields, we do have a chance for witnessing. And I'd like to offer, again, to honor the Dominicans for preaching and teaching, and say that there will always, always be a place for that. And I would also like to just say that in our own ways, that we can come together, whether it's a lay community, a parish, the orders, that we can express a civilization of love through our common life together, particularly in the way we honor each other, the way we think the best of each other, the way we forgive each other. These are things that the world cannot give, and that the world is hoping for and in such need of. So today this weekend's been great for me, and I want to thank all of you.
And thank you for that. Thank you, because I want to do some thanks. We have a small but energetic and excellent staff here at the DSBT. And you've seen our staff running around with video, with the microphones, with taking food out, bringing things back. This could not have happened without our staff support. So thank you very much to our staff here. You see a lot of our Dominican student brothers, but also a lot of our lay students are here today. And I would like all of our students, whether Dominican, other religious, and lay, would the students please stand up? And thank you for coming to be part of this today. And I'm very grateful for Father Michael Sweeney, my predecessor as president of the DSBT, and Manuel, who really organized this whole event. The two of them conceived of the idea of the College of Fellows, and it has grown and grown and grown, and the Convocation has grown, and the members of the College of Fellows have been telling me that this is the best ever. And last year they said that was the best ever. And the year before that they said that was the best ever, which means it's getting better and better and better. And so I'm grateful for Father Michael Sweeney and Manuel of putting together the College of Fellows, and all of you who are members of the College of Fellows. You fellows, thank you so much for being part of the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology, for the expertise that you bring, the reflections that you bring to us, and especially for the friendship that you build among each other and with us. And the visitors and other guests who gave presentations today, let us again thank all of our presenters for their wonderful reflections today. We put out an email newsletter announcing these kinds of events. And if you are not receiving these and would like to, we have a sign-up sheet where you can just very carefully print your name and your email to get on our email list. And this newsletter goes out usually once a month, maybe once every 3 weeks. And it's just a one-page to announce these events coming up. We now have time for a reception, and the reception is going to be in that area, and we have some wonderful treats and drinks for you all. And Manuel, do you have anything to add?
We are going to have the reception, and I would like to take a moment also to thank Abraham, who has this little cafe just on the north side of the Cal campus on Euclid, just next to Laval's. And he's right in the back there. It's called Abe's Cafe. He and his two sisters run this really small cafe, and Abraham is a wonderful example of the evangelization that we've been talking about needing to happen. If you go into his cafe, you will be welcomed so warmly. He knows so many people by name. He has contacts with all kinds of departments now at Cal. And he's very busy, and he does this only with his two sisters, but he will treat everyone that comes in with so much care. It's fascinating to watch. And Paul, who's right next to him, can also attest to this because he's a regular frequenter. But Abraham also has great coffee, so if you want a cappuccino or an espresso, go to Abe's. So thank you again, Abe. The one thing I forgot to mention is he is in the leadership of Jóvenes para Cristo, working in the 3 dioceses right here in the Bay Area. So he's very active also in evangelization, in helping us spread the gospel among the Hispanic youth and helping them to evangelize. So he is an active example also of the kind of evangelization that we're hoping will occur in our culture.